If you stand in the Petén jungle of Guatemala at dawn, you can hear the past breathing through you. The air hums with cicadas, and somewhere underfoot, beneath roots and centuries of soil, an entire empire sleeps. Archaeologists call it the classic Maya world, a patchwork of city-states that once ruled this forest like constellations on Earth. Today, it's all green and silence, but if you look close, the hills aren't exactly hills at all. They're temples, pyramids, palaces, entire skylines swallowed by vines. The jungle didn't destroy the Maya. It hid them. That's the first lie people tell about the collapse, that it just means disappearance. The truth is a little bit stranger. Sometimes civilizations don't die at all, they just turn invisible. 2,000 years ago, this forest was mapped in human order. The Maya carved roads through limestone, engineered reservoirs to trap the rain, and raised stone cities so tall they brushed the canopy. They didn't just live within nature, they choreographed it. From 250 to 900 CE, their world stretched across modern-day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, a network of kingdoms connected by trade and belief. They built cities where no rivers flowed, wrote books no one alive could yet read, and measured time with a precision that we to this day still envy. They were the astronomers of the tropics. Every temple was a clock, every ruler a priest of the sun. Their mathematics included zero long before Europe stumbled upon it. Their calendar predicted eclipses centuries in advance. They built entire cities around the rhythm of the heavens. Tikal's great plaza aligned to the solstice. Palenque's temple of inscriptions tracked Venus. In Copan, the hieroglyphic stairway read like a prayer to time itself. It's easy to forget, or maybe we just prefer to, that civilizations rise not because of any mystery, but because of the organization. Now, the Maya had both. But the same precision that made them remarkable also made them quite fragile. Order requires upkeep, and balance can break it all down. If you lived in a Maya city around 800 CE, you'd wake to smoke and sound. Farmers carried maize and cacao to market, scribes inked new glyphs onto codices, and stonemasons hammered away at the next pyramid, because the gods, like kings, demanded progress. Every monument was a promise to eternity, carved by hands that never imagined the jungle would take it back. That's the thing about permanence. It's only convincing while you're still alive. When the rains stopped, and they did, not once but many times, the system began to unravel. The lakes shrank, crops failed, and the gods grew restless. Rulers ordered grander ceremonies, deeper sacrifices, and higher temples. If the world was faltering, maybe it needed to be reminded who ran it. But drought doesn't answer prayers, and stone doesn't feed people. Power, once divine, began to look human again, and human things can fall apart. Centuries later, when Spanish explorers stumbled through the same jungles, they asked the questions that we still do today. How could such brilliance vanish? But that's the wrong question. The Maya didn't vanish, they adapted. When the cities emptied, the people stayed. They built smaller villages, closer to water and farther away from kings. They shed monuments and carried their memories instead. The jungle didn't bury their story out of malice. It just sort of kept it safe. Every root and vine that wrapped around a temple was a form of preservation. A green archive waiting for someone patient enough to read it again. That forest that devoured the cities was the same one that kept them from turning into dust. By the height of the classic period, the Maya world was less a single civilization than a constellation. hundreds of cities orbiting one another in a sort of uneasy harmony. Each had its own ruler, its own patron gods, and its own version of history carved into their limestone. Yet they all spoke the same architectural language. Pyramids rose like stairways for the divine. Courtyards mirrored the cosmos. And at the heart of every city stood a temple where the ruler, draped in jade and quetzal feathers, would climb toward the sky to remind the universe he belonged there. The world revolved around time, and time was not linear. It looped and folded, a pattern that repeated itself endlessly. The Maya saw existence as cycles, nested inside even larger cycles. Harvests within years, years within ages, ages within eternities. The calendar wasn't a record of days passing, it was the machinery of the universe that we lived in. When a king performed a ritual, he wasn't just pleasing the gods, he was keeping the gears of reality in sync. If you controlled time, you controlled meaning. That belief turned administration into religion. Kings became astronomers and mathematicians. Priests then became bureaucrats. Every decision, when to plant, when to wage war, when to crown a successor, was written in the stars. Cities like Tikal and Calakmul, separated by hundreds of miles of dense forest, could predict the same eclipse to the same day. They fought over trade routes, territory, and prestige, but they agreed on one thing. Time had to keep working, no matter what it cost. And it did, for centuries. Between 600 and 800 CE, the Maya built their greatest monuments. Tikal's pyramids reached over 200 feet, taller than any structure in North America at the time. Palenque's temples' inscriptions ran like stone pottery, chronicling dynasties that lasted longer than most nations do now. At Copan, scribes recorded histories so detailed that we can trace lineages generation by generation as if the past were a living archive. Archaeologists have unearthed markets that could feed tens of thousands, reservoirs engineered to survive dry seasons, and road networks wide enough for armies to march through the jungle. They even had ball courts where players reenacted cosmic battles, a mix of sport and sacrament. Even their art carried mathematics. Carvings balanced perfectly around axes of symmetry, glyphs arranged in harmonic ratios. To live in a Maya city was to live inside of a clock. But clocks can only run if someone winds them. And by the late 8th century, the gears began to grind. Population boomed, forests vanished, and the soil thinned. Cities once sustained by maize fields found themselves surrounded by stumps and eroded earth. The same ingenuity that allowed them to thrive, irrigation, terraces, and constant expansion, pushed the environment to exhaustion. The Maya had built a system that depended on precision, but that very precision left no room for any error. As resources dwindled, rivalry sharpened. Stone carvings from the period show rulers capturing and decapitating one another. Entire cities recording victories that probably didn't happen. Propaganda is an old trick, and when things start to fall apart, you build more monuments to prove that they aren't. The temples grew even taller, the rituals even bloodier. The kings doubled down on what they knew: ceremony, sacrifice, and spectacle. You can see the desperation in the archaeology. Rushed construction, reused stones, half-finished carvings, abandoned mid-chisel. The aesthetic grandeur of the late Classic era was also its death rattle. Some historians argue that drought was the match that lit it all. Lake bed sediment showed decades-long dry spells beginning in the 820s. Others point to political fragmentation, 1,000 kings ruling 1,000 fiefdoms. The truth is probably both. When the environment strained, alliances cracked. Trade routes failed and wars became endemic. For the ordinary Maya, the farmers, masons, and scribes who kept the machine running, Collapse wasn't all so dramatic. It was gradual. Less rain, less food, and fewer festivals. The gods stopped answering, or maybe the kings just stopped listening. Cities emptied not with fire, but with footsteps, people leaving one by one, until the jungle slowly reclaimed what had been theirs all along. Still, for centuries before that final silence, the Maya had done something extraordinary. They turned time into architecture and belief into math. Even as their cities fell, their ideas endured, carved deep enough that not even 1,000 years of vines could erase them. Sometime in the late 9th century, the inscription stopped. Across the Maya world, the stone chroniclers, those endless lines of glyphs recording births, wars, marriages, and divine bloodlines, just stopped. The last known date carved into the stairs of Copan reads 822 CE. After that, nothing. It's like the civilization ran out of words mid-sentence. To archaeologists, that silence is louder than any collapse that we could record. It wasn't a single dramatic apocalypse, no falling meteor or marching army. It was a slow motion unraveling, the kind that creeps instead of crashes. Cities were abandoned at different times, for different reasons, until all that was left were the ghosts of roads that led to nowhere. The droughts were real. Lake sediment cores across the Yucatan tell the same story. Dry years stacking into dry decades. Crops failed, reservoirs cracked, and the jungle browned. When water disappears, politics follows. The great city-states that once traded obsidian and jade began raiding one another for grain. Archaeologists have found arrowheads embedded in the bones of the same people who once built pyramids together. The era of stargazers gave way to an era of soldiers. And yet the collapse wasn't just about hunger or war. It was psychological. The entire Maya worldview was built on the assumption of order. Cosmic, agricultural, social. Time was not supposed to stop. And when it did, everything lost meaning. Temples were expanded even as population shrank, as if to bargain with the gods through architecture. Offerings became frantic. Jade and shells buried deeper and deeper, bloodletting rituals growing more extreme. You can almost feel the desperation in the artifacts. It was faith running now on fumes. In cities like Tikal, the last monuments were carved with smaller glyphs, crammed into every spare inch of space they could find, and there was no room left for any new prophecy, just repetition of old ones. It's as though the scribes kept writing until the end, refusing to admit that there would be no one left to read. In Palenque, unfinished reliefs show kings half-carved, faces incomplete. In some temples, workers seem to have walked off mid-build, leaving their tools where they fell. Collapse in reality looks less like ruin and more just like interruption. When the rains failed, migration began. Families abandoned the lowland capitals and moved to smaller settlements along the coast and highlands where water still ran. The political order dissolved, but the people didn't vanish. In the highlands of Guatemala and Chiapas, those communities survived. Farmers instead of astronomers, villages instead of cities. Civilization didn't end, it just downsized. The forest did the rest. Within a few generations, vines thickened over causeways, trees sprouted through roofs, and roofs cracked staircases. The jungle wasn't reclaiming, it was recovering. Without axes and fires, it returned to equilibrium. In that sense, the collapse might have saved the ecosystem the Maya had pushed to the brink. Civilization ended, but the forest healed. When the Spanish finally arrived 6 centuries later, they found Maya villages, but no empires. Scattered descendants who still spoke the language, still worshipped in modified temples, still kept their calendar in secret. To the conquistadors, it looked like an empty world waiting to be conquered. But it wasn't empty. It was resting. What's haunting is how consistent the evidence is. Across dozens of cities, from Calakmul in the north to Copan in the south, You can see the same pattern. Monumentality peaking right before abandonment. The last burst of creativity before exhaustion. Historians call it the terminal classic, a sterile phrase for the moment a civilization realizes it's over, but keeps performing anyway. You can read it like an equation. Drought plus overpopulation plus war plus ideology equals implosion. But that misses something a little deeper. The collapse wasn't just environmental or political, it was also emotional. A civilization built on the promise of cosmic order could not survive chaos. When nature stopped cooperating, belief cracked first and everything else followed. Still, the silence wasn't total. In mountain villages, priests and farmers kept fragments of the old knowledge. Star cycles, agricultural rituals, the sense that time turned in circles. The great cities died, but the story kept breathing, just in smaller rooms, whispered by people who refused to forget. By the time Spanish ships appeared off the coast of Yucatan in the early 1500s, the Maya world had already done its collapsing. There were still cities, Mayapan, Tayasal, but they were smaller, fragmented, living on the aftershocks of a civilization that had once stretched across an empire of rain and stone. The descendants of the builders of Tikal were still there, planting maize, speaking Quiche, Yucatec, weaving the same glyphic patterns into their textiles that once adorned palace walls. Civilization hadn't vanished, it had retreated into people. That's the part of the collapse, the part history tends to forget because it doesn't photograph as well as the ruins. When Hernan Cortés marched through in 1525, he found more resistance than riches. The Spanish wrote about savages in stone cities, never realizing that those savages were the grandchildren of astronomers. The Maya fought them in guerrilla campaigns that lasted centuries. The Itza kingdom of Tayasal, built on a lake island surrounded by water and memory, didn't fall until 1697. Almost 200 years after the first conquest began. And through it all, they kept their knowledge alive in disguise. Catholic missionaries burned the codices, bark paper books filled with astronomy, math, and mythology, but couldn't erase the patterns. Farmers still planted according to celestial cycles. Rituals to saints still mirrored offerings to older gods. The Maya calendar survived by hiding in plain sight, stitched into festivals and agricultural rites. The Spanish may have conquered the land, but the clock kept running on Maya time. Centuries later, the world forgot them again. This time not through conquest, but through neglect. The jungle sealed their cities shut, and Western explorers reinvented them as mystery. When Stevens and Catherwood hacked their way into Copan and Palenque in the 1840s, they acted like they stumbled onto Atlantis. Their book sold thousands of copies in New York and London, spreading the idea of a lost civilization. It was romantic, dramatic, and sort of wrong. The Maya were never lost, the only thing missing was curiosity. By the early 20th century, archaeologists began to piece together the real story. Hieroglyphs once thought to be mere decoration turned out to be phonetic. A written language recording names, deeds, poetry, politics. Each inscription that came back to life reconnected a broken line of memory. When scholars finally cracked the code in the 1980s, the Maya stopped being mythical and became human again. Kings, astronomers, masons, scribes, people with taxes, rivalries, humor, and mistakes. The picture that emerged was messier, but far more beautiful. Collapse wasn't a single moment of doom, it was a process of change. Cities fell, but culture endured. The modern Maya, roughly 7 million people across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, still speak the languages of their ancestors, still grow maize as ritual, and still tell the same stories of gods who play ball with death and trade jokes with time. There's something deeply moving about that continuity. We think of civilizations as brittle, marble statues waiting to crack. But the Maya show that culture can bend and still hold. They proved survival isn't always about conquest or progress. Sometimes it's just about persistence, about knowing when to move, when to hide, and when to keep the sacred under your tongue until it's safe to say aloud again. Archaeologists now use LiDAR, laser mapping, to peer through the jungle canopy. What they've found in recent years rewrites everything. Beneath the trees are not isolated cities but networks. Thousands of roads, canals, terraces, and pyramids, all connected in ways no one had imagined before. The Maya weren't a collection of towns, they were a civilization the size of a small country, hidden under centuries of greenery. Every new discovery makes the old myth of disappearance look even more foolish. The Maya never left, we just stopped looking. If you walk through Tikal today, you can still feel the geometry. The temples rise above the jungle like stone lungs, breathing in heat and in history. The howler monkeys echo through plazas that once rang with drums. Moss grows on carved glyphs that record the names of kings long forgotten by the world, but remembered still by the forest. And maybe that's the most honest version of the story. Civilizations don't really fall, they fade into the background of the next one. The Maya weren't erased, they were absorbed into the same world that buried them. What we call ruins were once cities, and what we call collapse was just change, written in a different dialect of time. Because the jungle never truly took them, it just kept them safe until we were ready to listen again.